Farmers descend on Westminster to beg the government to change its mind on plans to make some farmers pay inheritance tax. We speak to Jeremy Clarkson, and a Treasury Minister will be with us live. And the government's own figures say winter fuel payment cuts will push more pensioners into poverty. Is this issue splitting Labour? Hello, welcome to Newsnight with insight and interviews. Tonight we'll speak live to the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, easy for me to say, about today's farmers' protests and a new development in their decision to means test winter fuel payments for pensioners. First though, farmers came to Westminster, as you know, to try and persuade the government to ditch its plan to make some farmers pay an inheritance tax of 20% on farms worth over £1 million. Some told me today it would mean they'd be forced to sell their farms because they wouldn't be able to afford to pay it. Farmers were a kind of mixture of furious and anguished and bewildered, and Jeremy Clarkson was amongst them. So why are you here, Mr. Clarkson?
Well, because I'm here to support farmers.
Right. Are you angry?
It's difficult to be angry on somebody else's behalf. That's like being... Yes, no, I'm not angry on someone else's behalf.
Right. So it's not about you, it's not about your farm and the fact that you bought a farm to avoid inheritance tax?
Classic BBC there, classic. Oh yeah, it's not the fact that I bought a farm to avoid inheritance tax. The fact.
You told the Sunday Times in 2021 that's why you bought it.
These people.
Sorry?
BBC. Okay, let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
I wanted a shoot, okay? That's even worse to the BBC. I wanted a shoot, which comes with the benefit of not having to pay inheritance tax. Now I do. But people like me will simply put it in a trust. And so long as I live for 7 years, that's fine. And as my daughter said, you will live for 7 years. You might be in a deep freeze at the end of it, but you will live for 7 years. But it's incredibly time-consuming to have to do that. And why should all these people have to do that? Why should they?
So one of the reasons Rachel Reeves says she brought this in is to stop wealthy people using it as a way.
No, that was the only reason she did.
Well, no, the other reason was to raise money for public services. Well, have you seen...
Are you listening to this?
Have you tried to get a GP appointment lately?
Yes, right. I just recently had a heart attack.
Okay, so you know it's tough.
Yes.
So where should they get the money from if it's not from farmers?
From farmers. You hear that, everyone?
With
BBC
assets.
thinks you should be paying for everything.
Clarkson,
do you know how many people pay inheritance tax in this country?
It's 4% of estates.
What?
4% of estates.
4% pay inheritance tax. 96% of the population of the UK does not pay inheritance tax.
Sure.
After this becomes law, 96% of farmers will.
Where have you got that figure from?
Who here, can I just ask, who here is going to be unaffected by these changes? No one.
Right. Where have you got the 96% figure
Well,
from?
you've got 96%. Well, the same place that Rachel Reeves does, from the middle of her head.
Right.
From the Sixth Form Debating Society that she was no doubt a member of,
okay.
which formed her opinions and yours.
I am not expressing opinions.
Yes.
I'm literally asking you questions. You know that, Mr. Clarkson.
Right.
So, what is your message to this government?
Please back down, please.
And get the money from where?
Well, they've got 40 billion. I'll tell you where you get the... Walk into any of the offices around here. If you don't understand what somebody's job is, fire them.
And how
the civil service is too top. You know that. I must get on.
Jeremy Clarkson with us in the studio. Sir Jake Berry, former Tory chair and a minority shareholder in a company which owns a small farm in Wales which wouldn't be affected by the inheritance tax changes. And Jim Murphy, former Labour Secretary of State for Scotland and close to the Starmer team. Welcome, both of you. What did you make of Mr. Clarkson, what he had to say?
Well, I know I'm in a minority, but it's the first time I've ever seen him on television. I don't watch cooking or motorcar programmes, and I hear a rumour that he does at least one of those. So
he does a farming programme now. He's a farmer.
He's a farmer now. Okay. Look, I think the farmers are pretty ill served by him being one of their spokespeople.
Why?
Well, I think he's rude. I think he's aggressive. I think from what I've read, he invested in a farm for inheritance tax reasons. I think it's a disservice to the hard-working hundreds of thousands of farmers in the country. But look, the more substantial point is that the new Labour government has had a budget that is really pretty consequential. And I know there are some people unnerved that we're still debating it 3 weeks later, but I don't think the Labour Party will be that unnerved by it. Because this is probably...
You don't think they'll be unnerved by today?
I mean, did
today go well for the Labour
government? I don't think there'll be a nervousness about a continuing debate about how we have to reset the economy. Because they were elected at a time when personal income tax is at highest in history. And I'm not here to proselytise for the Labour Party. Jake isn't here to argue the Tory Party's case either. But it is a fact that personal taxes are higher than they've ever been. And Labour couldn't increase personal taxes. So they faced a choice, cut the NHS pretty drastically or introduce a set of taxes around assets, and that's what they've done. And on this in particular, just on a particular point, on inheritance tax, the butcher, the baker and the candlestick maker are going to have to pay inheritance tax if they pass their businesses on. And Labour's saying farmers shouldn't be exempt from that. But there are exemptions.
Sure.
They'll pay it at half the rate as everyone else.
Jim, that's not correct, is it? So we have two systems, and both of them are an acknowledgement that if you have a butcher, baker, candlestick maker, or in fact a small family farm, if you have to split that business up because of the death of a proprietor, whoever he or she may be, then you have no business after it, which is why for decades we've had business property relief and agricultural property relief, both of which the Labour Party has sought to reduce in this budget. And
we're
I
going
appreciate
to hear,
they have to find money. But
many farmers are on
I was
that.
there at the protest like you were today, and I was talking to farmers, and actually I think you're wrong, actually. I think Jeremy Clarkson is warmly regarded by the farming community because he, whether you like what he stands for or what he says, he draws public attention to the plight of farmers. And if you look, for example, at cereal farmers, they've had a 73% drop in their income because of the adverse weather we've had. So it is a sector under massive pressure. And what I think, when I was there, what people are asking me is what people are really concerned about is it doesn't feel like the Labour Party has got a real grip on the number of people who are going to be affected by this. It feels like a stab in the dark, and I saw you having a bit of a debate with Jeremy about how many people would be affected. DEFRA, the government's agricultural department, says that 66% of farms are worth over £1 million. The Treasury says that only a third of farms are going to be affected by this.
I go on the HMRC figures.
They can't be. Well, the HMRC figures are wrong. You are wrong to go on them because the HMRC figures. No, I'll tell you why they're wrong. The HMRC figures only deal with farms that would have benefited from agricultural property relief. That's not how farms work. Farms also use business property relief for non-fixed assets, cattle, combine harvesters, grain in the grain silo is all dealt with business property relief.
Let me ask
and actually,
you about...
most farms would use both, and that's why this is a perfect storm for farming, because they're closing both reliefs, stopping people passing their farms on to the next generation.
Kemi Badenoch was there today, leader of the Conservatives, Nigel Farage of Reform, Sir Ed Davey of the Lib Dems, all see this now as a chance to win the farming vote. How are the Tories going to fight off Reform for this rural vote? Or can they, when both Mr Farage and Boris Johnson, as was then, were advocates of Brexit, which has damaged farmers?
Well, look, I think it's a very different debate than Brexit. The main thing about farming...
The main thing about farming... The inheritance tax changes is like the straw that's broken the camel's back after Brexit,
yes, but let's talk about what happened in the last budget just 3 weeks ago. I'm
asking you how Reform...
You asked me which straw broke the camel's back. So I don't think Brexit has affected farming in the way you say, because actually most products in the UK are sold to our domestic market. That's the first thing to say about Brexit.
Well, the NFU said this year, since Brexit, subsidies for farms have fallen by up to 37%.
But if we look at, that's why I want to talk about this budget. So let's look at what happened. So farmers had a transition period till 2028 to deal with something called the Basic Farm Payment Scheme, which is the acreage scheme they got paid. They were told that would be until 2028. That has been brought in to 2025. For some farms, seeing a 60% drop of their income. That's nothing to do with Brexit.
Okay.
That's a decision by the Labour government. Look at the tax on double cab pickups with the farm vehicle of choice. That has gone up in this budget by 211%. Look at the loss of business property relief and the loss of inheritance tax relief. That is why farmers were protesting on the street today, saying this is a perfect storm for farming.
Is this a problem for Labour? I mean, people People are saying they don't get rural Britain.
I don't think that's fair, but I understand why people say it. But no matter who you introduce a tax about or on, there's going to be protests. And what the Labour Party has to do, strategically what it has to be, is it has to balance the books, it has to get the public finances in equilibrium. I noticed that Kemi Badenoch was there today. I'm not here to give her advice, but
you're about to.
Well, I think she's got to be careful, because in the few weeks that she's been in office, she's already adopted two pretty expensive spending commitments. One is to reverse the VAT on private education, and the second one is to reverse this inheritance tax changes. And if she's not careful, I think she'll end up getting to a point at the next election that she'll have acquired so many expensive spending commitments that she'll be all opposition and no leadership.
We'll see. We'll come back to you in a second. We're going to hear from more farmers who I spoke to today.
I've got £3 million worth of cattle stood in the shed. That's my livestock. That's before starting my assets. But we've got no money. Every penny we make is ploughed back into the farm for the next generation. If that's gone, that's gone. You look at these young people here, they've got no future if this carries on. They're finished.
We work all the hours God sends to put food on everybody's tables, and to think that my grandfather has passed this down to my mother, to my brother, and we could end up losing this. We've always worked to farm. We were never going to do anything else, and yeah, it's so upsetting. It's heartbreaking.
I fear many families, we can relate, but around the country will end up losing their farms.
Do you think this Labour government understands the countryside? I mean, they won a number of seats in rural constituencies.
They wouldn't. They did. Their heart's not in it. I just can't see it. Whatever they've done at the moment has been destroying the people of the country.
The government cannot assume that we just want to sell these assets. They're not, they're ours. We want to hold on to them. It's because it's our land, it's our farm. And this will be the end of family farms.
Do you really think that's the case?
In many cases, yes, that small farms will have to be forced to sell to larger landowners, and the small family businesses, they're gone. It's completely unfair.
Nick, are there some anxious Labour MPs? What are you picking up?
I would say, Vic, that most Labour MPs take Jim Murphy's view, which is that they absolutely see the point of this. But we are beginning to see the first concerns amongst Labour MPs in these new rural seats they've got. So Steve Witherden, who's a Welsh Labour MP, talking about he needs to see the modelling of the impact on family farms. John Whitby, but Derbyshire Dale, saying he would like to see some mitigation, that is, some softening of it. And then Andy McNair, I believe he might possibly be familiar to Jake Berry because he unseated the sitting Conservative MP in Rossendale and Darwin, and he's saying he would like to take the concerns of farmers back to the Treasury. But other Labour MPs, they are being supportive. Here's one. I've met my farmers and I've said I've got to be able to look them in the eye and know we're doing the right things. Who should shoulder the burden? Narrow or broad shoulders? We know it should be broad shoulders because of the state of the public finances. In terms of the government, they are putting on a united front. They're saying no backing down, no softening. But of course, last week I did report that the Department of Environment were trying to hope at easing the rules for older farmers who can't make use of the 7-year inheritance tax rule they were sat on by the Treasury.
Well, Prime Minister Keir Starmer talked about this at the G20 conference today. This is what he had to say.
The example I've given is a typical example of parents wanting to pass on a farm to one of their children. And in those cases, when you look at all the thresholds available, that means that only farms over the value of £3 million will be affected by the changes, and therefore the vast majority of farms will be unaffected, and those that are affected will only pay half the inheritance tax that other people pay, 20%, and they will have a 10-year period over which to pay it.
Over which to pay it were his final words. Let's talk to the Exchequer Secretary at the Treasury, James Murray. Good evening to you, Mr. Murray. Thank you for talking to our audience. Farmers are distraught. That's the word they use today to me, because they say they won't be able to afford to pass down their family farms to their children. When that farm is passed down, those inheriting it never get to realise that capital, and farm profits aren't enough to pay the inheritance tax. So the farm, they say, would have to be sold to foreign investors or housing developers. And that family farm producing food for British consumers is gone forever. Can you empathise with that?
I can understand there is a real strength of feeling about the decision that we've taken, and that people might be anxious if they're trying to work out if these changes might affect them. And what I would really encourage everyone to do who's anxious about this is to find out about how inheritance tax works.
Don't
seek
you
advice.
think that's
advice.
exactly what they have been doing since the budget? That's rather patronising, isn't it, Mr. Murray?
No, I think that inheritance tax is something that many people who have been accessing agricultural property relief since the last changes in 1992, they may not have looked into the detail of inheritance tax because they haven't had to think about it
right. And those
for the
that
last
have
30
and
years.
know that they will be affected, I mean, if they're affected, that is it. That they say they're going to have to sell their farms.
Well, look, it's really important that people look at how it works, get the right financial advice, because there are a number of different nil rate bans, spousal transfers, gifting rules and so on. And what that means is you have the Prime Minister
your advice
say,
is get some tax planning advice to find a way of avoiding it.
well, these are straightforward rules that exist in the tax system already around gifting. 7 years later, there is no inheritance tax due. It tapers within that 7-year period. Spousal transfers, nil rate bans. As the Prime Minister said, if you look at a typical couple who own a farm and want to pass it on to their descendants, they get up to £3 million before they pay any inheritance tax. On top of that, any inheritance tax that is due above £3 million on the marginal amount, that's at half the normal rate,
Sure.
and it's payable over 10 years, interest-free.
We know that DEFRA, the Environment Department, wanted to soften the edges. Nick reported that last week. Potentially, could you exempt people over the age of 80? Those are the people who this is really going to affect. This comes in April 2026. They may not live that 7 years. Why not consider that?
No, we're not going to make any changes. This is the policy that the Chancellor announced, and this is the policy of the government. And I was with the Secretary of State from DEFRA yesterday talking to MPs, and we were both setting out the government policy and how it will work. You know, what's important is to emphasise this is a proportionate response to make sure that we protect small family farms whilst also raising the revenue we need to support public services, which will benefit rural communities too.
One of the reasons your government has said you're bringing in these changes is because the current system is unfair and that you have to make, as you say, tough choices to fill the black hole you say you inherited so you can invest in the NHS and state schools. There's no obligation on King Charles to pay inheritance tax. He can choose to pay it if he wishes. Is that fair?
I'm not going to comment on individual taxpayers' situation. What we talk about...
I'm just asking you whether, in principle, is that fair?
Well, he's still an individual taxpayer as it relates to his private estates. You know, what we're talking about here is the rules which apply to estates subject to agricultural property relief.
Okay,
and
but let me ask you a different
relief.
question. Are there any plans to make that compulsory, for example?
To make what compulsory, sorry?
The monarch having to pay inheritance tax, sovereign to sovereign?
No, we have no plans on that front.
Right. Why not?
Because we're not going to comment on individual taxpayers' affairs, and we're concentrating on filling the budget gap that we inherited from the previous government.
I want to ask you about winter fuel payments and figures released by the DWP today, but first Nick has this.
Thanks, Vic. And I tell you what, this will be of real interest to our panel and particularly to Jim, who is a former Work and Pensions Minister. So it's nearly 4 months since Rachel Reeves announced that she would be means testing the winter fuel payments. And today we learnt that when the Chancellor made that announcement on the 29th of July, the government had done what it called internal modelling, which showed that that change would result in each year in question in an estimated additional 100,000 pensioners in relative poverty after housing costs in 2025, 2026. Recently they did some new modelling and they showed that that figure was 50,000. But let's just take a look at our screens now and let's see whether the fact of those calculations is consistent with what the government has been saying. So there you are, right there, you can see what Liz Kendall, the Work and Pensions Secretary, said today, and she talked about, as I was saying, that at the time of the original policy decision, there was some internal modelling. Let's look at what Keir Starmer said in September during a visit to Washington. He said this: "There isn't a report on my desk, which somehow we're not showing. I know you think there's a report on my desk, but there isn't one." Now, it looks like the Prime Minister has a get-out-of-jail card, because what he was talking about there was a formal impact assessment. And as I was saying, this is more informal internal modelling. But is what the Prime Minister said there, is that consistent with the Ministerial Code? Take a look at that. Ministers must abide by the 7 principles of public life, and 2 of those, there you are, you can see them, are openness. Holders of public office should act and take decisions in an open and transparent manner. And there you go. Next one, honesty. Holders of public office should be truthful.
Mr Murray, Sir Keir Starmer, when he announced the decision about means testing winter fuel payments, he knew how pensioners would be affected. He had that internal modelling, he knew.
Well, look, when we took that decision about winter fuel payments to make sure they targeted those in greatest need, it was a difficult decision, and the Prime Minister was very upfront about that.
The decision was. I was asking you about him saying he had no report on his desk about the impact, but actually he knew what the impact would be.
Well, look, as your report made clear, this is internal modelling, and as far as I understand, as far as I understand from the internal modelling, there were key aspects of our policy which were not considered at the time. So, for instance, the uptake in pension credit, which we've been pushing over summer since the announcement in July, the extension of the household support fund, and so on. That hasn't been factored into the modelling, so it's internal modelling only.
Right. So was he being straightforward with people?
Well, look, I know how important it is to the Prime Minister to follow the principles of public life. You know, I think everyone who knows him and works with him and knows anything about him knows how important that is to him in the way that he conducts himself.
So the DWP figures today estimate that an extra 50,000 pensioners will be living in relative poverty next year because of your decision to means test winter fuel payments. Do you think anyone voted for Labour in July to push more pensioners into poverty?
I think what people voted for in July was stability. People voted for us to get the economy back on track. People voted for us to fix the public finances.
And do you think they thought that would include pushing more pensioners into poverty?
Well, we also know that after the election, we uncovered a £22 billion black hole in year spending pressures.
The OBR said it was 9.5 billion.
Well, that was in February. The figure of 22 billion is in July. It grew in the period between the OBR looking at the figures in February and our uncovering the figures in July. That's why it's 22 billion.
I'm talking about the OBR report that came out in November. It said 9.5 billion.
The OBR, yes, but that was in February.
Right.
And the 22 billion was in July. It grew from February to July. That's how those figures are consistent. But that is our challenge as a government, because we need to fix the public finances, and that means, as with the decision we've taken about agricultural property relief, restricting that, the same with the decision about winter fuel payments, targeting that. These are difficult decisions, but they're necessary to fix the public finances, restore stability and put our country back on track.
What's your advice to pensioners who don't qualify for pension credit, so who won't get the winter fuel payment this Christmas, and they're anxious, as it gets colder, about putting the heating on?
Look, I can understand that people might be anxious, but we want to put this. Well, I want to put this in the context of the fact that
I wasn't asking you for context. I was asking, what's your advice as a government minister to those pensioners who are worried about keeping warm?
Well, we know there's the household support fund, so I'd encourage anyone, not just pensioners, also other families who might be concerned about living costs over the period ahead, to look at the household support fund in their local area. But I'd also, remind people that the state pension is due to go up by £470 next April, and we've committed to the triple lot.
Only if you're on the new state pension, and that comes in next April. Most pensioners are not on the new state pension.
But we've committed to the triple lock for the course of this Parliament, and so we can only commit
won't help
to
them
things.
This winter.
Well, we can only commit to things like the triple lock because of what I said about us fixing the public finances and getting the economy back on track.
Sharon Graham from the Unite Union told Newsnight in September that if pensioners don't put the heating on because they were worried, the worst that could happen is that some will die. What will you do if that happens?
Well, obviously no one wants to see that, but that's why we've extended the household support fund. That's why we've extended cold weather payments. That's why we're doing everything we can to drive the take-up of pension credit, which entitles people in the greatest need to winter fuel allowance payments too.
But if you're just over that, you don't qualify for it.
Well, as I say, it's a tough decision which we had to take, but the reason why we've taken that tough decision and the tough decision we were talking about earlier is to fix the public finances, because without that stability, without that fiscal responsibility, we cannot get the investment and growth we need in the long run.
OK, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Thank you, James Murray from the Treasury. I want to ask Jim Murphy, you're a former Labour leader in Scotland. The current Labour leader in Scotland, Anas Sarwar, today announced that if Labour form the next government there, then he will restore the winter fuel payment to all pensioners, but the wealthier ones will get a bit less. What do you think of that?
Well, that's the nature of devolution here across the UK. The leaders of the Welsh Labour Party, the Scottish Labour Party, or make their own decisions. Now, Anas
Why
is
is he
able.
doing it?
Anas is able to do that because he's got the Barna consequentials coming out of the budget. He's doing it, I assume, one, because he believes it, and two, he has an election coming and pensioners always vote.
Right.
But on the more general point, and I'm not trying to avoid it at all, but the more general point, when you look at the statistics, if you look across the generations, which generation is the least likely to be in poverty? Of course there are some poor pensioners, of course there are. But pensioners are the least likely generation to be in poverty in the UK. The average pension went up.
1.9 million pensioners are in relative poverty, and this winter fuel payment cut will push more in.
Into relative poverty rather than absolute poverty.
I'm sorry, if you're in poverty, you're not going, oh, is it relative or absolute?
No, but the point is that relative poverty is a much harder target to achieve, and it's the right one to try and achieve. But the wider point is the state pension's gone up by £900 this year. Where Labour should, in my opinion, be arguing and placing its investment is those people who are poorest. And Labour's made some really big decisions.
The problem
and
is
they're not. Hold on,
the Chancellor a month and a half to make the points you're making.
Yeah, I've got a lot of criticism about this, but so Labour's making 2 points. And then go to Jake.
I will.
Labour's making some big argument, making some big policy decisions without accompanying it with a big argument. The inherent inequality in our society is amongst the younger. And for example, the universal credit upgrade for children, the poorest people in this country, has gone up by £200 in the last year. The pension has gone up by 900. Look, inequality is generational, and the generation that experiences it most are the young. Okay. On the politics of this, I have been critical. Labour has often become a commentator about its own policy rather than agitating for it. And government isn't just about policy, it isn't just about government, it's also about politics. Right. And it's almost as if politics stopped the day of the election.
Jake Berry, I want to put to you that you were chair of the Tory party when Liz Truss pretty much crashed the economy. That is one of the reasons why Labour argue they have to make these kind of decisions. Do you
I think you sort of roundly sort of debunked quite a lot of the figures the Labour Party is committed. One of the biggest gaps we have.
Sorry,
one of the biggest gaps we have.
Do you accept that?
I am answering the question. If you give me a moment to do so. One of the biggest gaps we have in terms of this fiscal black hole is the amount of money the government has poured into public sector pay rises since the general election.
And you didn't fund any of those things. You had those.
Well, so that's not actually correct, because they were funded to 2% within the fiscal envelope.
You didn't tell anybody.
It's the fact that the Labour Party, for example, with junior doctors, has given them a 22% pay rise.
They say because they were trying to restore pay back to 2010 levels.
Politics is about choices, isn't it? They have chosen to give people who will become some of the highest paid people in our society a 22% pay rise, while at the same time taking the winter fuel payment away from the poorest pensioners. And I just go back, I actually think that wealthy pensioners getting the winter fuel payment was a bad thing.
Did you ever say that in government?
Yeah, well, I did actually say it in government. I think actually it was unarguable that the King probably doesn't require his winter fuel payment. The system was that he would get it. So there was a fair way that the Labour Party could have done this, to attach it to being a basic rate taxpayer, to withdraw it, which I think is what Anas Sarwar is proposing in Scotland, to withdraw it on a sort of a graduated basis, not creating this cliff edge where you earn £12,000 in your pension and suddenly you lose it all. That's what Anas Sarwar is proposing. That is actually the right thing to do. I think if the Labour government had proposed that, it would have been impossible almost for Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives, my party, to argue against that, because it is absurd, frankly, that you have very, very wealthy pensioners getting a winter fuel payment. It's a policy that has been implemented in a disastrous way. It's exactly the same, actually, as the withdrawing of agricultural relief for farmers. I think if you said
when Kemi Badenoch was running for leadership last time, she actually did say she had constituents of hers telling her that they didn't need the winter fuel payment because they could afford their heating bills, and she wondered, or wished, as she put it, there was a more sophisticated way of testing people.
She's right. Yeah.
Did you vote
I didn't know she said that.
Yeah.
But she
did you vote for her in the leadership?
I'm glad she is. Well, I've remained undeclared about the leadership, but I back Kemi. Well, just because I am a former member of Parliament. I think who individual Conservative Party members vote for should not really be of interest. I support Kemi as the new. Well, I'm sure you are, but I'm still not going to tell you.
Okay.
But
you support Kemi Badenoch
and actually, I just want to make the final point on this agricultural relief. I know we're talking about pensioners, but actually, I did support Tom to do that in the first place. But actually, if on the farming test they said that only active farmers get the inheritance tax exemption, I would support that.
Okay.
And I just think these are important things to do. They're just being done in such a terrible way. I just wonder who's advising the Labour Party and the Treasury. It's a mess.
Who's advising the Labour Party and the Treasury?
It's not you, Jim.
You have to ask James. James is whoever it is, they've got some of the big calls right. They don't have the politics right behind it, and they have to make a more political argument about their policy.
Front pages of tomorrow's newspapers, the Daily Telegraph. The PM claims the BBC has backed him over the farm raid. He's talking about a BBC Verify report on the numbers of farms that will be affected by the changes in inheritance tax. The Daily Express, a picture of a little girl who was there today. When I grow up, I wanted to be a farmer. The Daily Mail, the day Clarkson's farmer army parked their tractors on Starmer's lawn, but their main headline, Putin clears the way for a nuclear strike. Fears grow over Russian hybrid warfare campaign against the West, says The Guardian, and pictures of some more kids at the protest today. And the Financial Times, Kyiv fires US missiles for the first time inside Russia since Biden lifted curbs. And The Mirror, Putin's nuke threat. By the way, thanks for your messages about farms and inheritance tax. This viewer said, so tired of hearing about what a hard life farmers have. I work over 70 hours per week and I have for over 30 years. I'm also away from home 5 days and 4 nights. There are lots of people like me who have to work in adverse circumstances, and we all have aspirations for the future well-being of our children. I think farmers should think themselves lucky that they are only having to pay half of what my family will have to pay. And this from another viewer, why shouldn't farmers pay their tax at the rate the rest of us do? Answer, their means of making a living are tied up in land and buildings that are essential to get a modest income, so cannot be financially split up without selling bits off the farm assets destined for the next generation. Thank you for those. We love hearing from you. We're on every single blooming platform, TikTok, Instagram, X, Threads, Blue Sky, email, and our WhatsApp is there, 03306 784 783. Oh my God, I've got more information for you. You can watch Newsnight on iPlayer. Look, you can put your phone up to that QR code and it will take you right there. Good luck. That's it from us tonight. We're back tomorrow. Thank you very much to Sir Jake Berry. Thank you to Jim Murphy. Nick's back with me tomorrow. Thanks for your company. See you then.